I hope I haven't disturbed you, Miss Charlotte.
What a surprise to find you hiding away.
The Count's unwanted bride. You are invited into a world of glittering deception and cold stone, where a single scandalous rumor can destroy a woman's name, and a forced marriage becomes a prison for two wounded souls. When proud Lady Charlotte Fairborne is betrayed and compelled to wed the remote, brooding Count Adrian de Vere, their union begins in silent resentment. But beneath his cold demeanor lies a deep, tormented grief, and a mystery that will either redeem them both or shatter them completely. Inspired by the intensity of Wuthering Heights and the drama of Bridgerton, this is a story of enemies to lovers, second chances, and the healing power of truth. Stay tuned as we begin this breathtaking, slow-burn romance, and be sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss a single moment of their journey from resentment to yearning. Part 1. The Scandal. The air in the ballroom of the Duke of Roxburgh's residence was thick and cloying, a suffocating melange of silk, lilies, and ambition. It was the height of the London season, a glittering, merciless spectacle that Lady Charlotte Fairborne had always tolerated more than enjoyed. At 25, her sharp wit and independent mind had rendered her a curiosity rather than a conquest, a fact she privately relished. She was not a sweet-tempered wallflower, nor was she a beauty of the first water, but she possessed a proud carriage and an uncompromising moral compass that were, to her mind, far more valuable. Tonight, however, her customary composure was being tested by the insistent, cloying attention of Lord Edwin Langford. Langford was a man who played the gentleman with a practiced ease, his charm a weapon he wielded with reckless precision, and Charlotte found him insufferably arrogant. He was too smooth, his compliments too extravagant, his devotion to social performance too complete. "My dear Charlotte," he murmured, catching her by the elbow as she attempted to secure a much-needed glass of lemonade, "you look positively radiant this evening. I swear, the Duchess's diamonds pale in comparison to the sparkle of your eyes." Charlotte offered him a cool, brittle smile that did not reach her eyes. "My lord, if you wish to discuss the relative luminance of my optics, a formal meeting with my oculist would surely be more appropriate than this crowded dance floor." Langford merely chuckled, the sound grating on her nerves. "Such wit! You wound me with your sharpness. All I desire is a moment of private conversation, away from this suffocating crush." She should have listened to the sudden sharp spike of apprehension that pricked her. She should have remembered the cautionary tales her ambitious mother, Lady Henrietta Fairborne, had always dinned into her about the perils of being too singular, too quick to deviate from the script. But Charlotte's pride, that formidable and often detrimental component of her character, rebelled against the notion of fleeing a mere conversation. "There is nothing you could possibly have to say to me, Lord Langford, that cannot be uttered within earshot of polite society," she stated, attempting to move toward the protection of a nearby chaperone. But Langford was quick. With a subtle, almost imperceptible shift of his body, he guided her through an archway, his hand firm on the small of her back. Before she could voice a protest, she found herself in a small, deserted salon, dimly lit by a single ornate candelabra and furnished for quiet tete-a-tetes. It was a space designed for private whispers, and precisely the sort of location a reputation could be lost in a matter of heartbeats. "You misunderstand me, Charlotte," Langford said, his voice dropping to a seductive stage whisper. He took a decisive step toward the door, and with a swift, malicious gesture, he closed it. The small, echoing click of the latch was the sound of a trap snapping shut. "I merely wish to inform you that I have waited quite long enough for your interest to be secured by conventional means. If you will not yield to my sincere admiration, then perhaps a small scandal will suffice to bring you to your senses." Charlotte's heart hammered against her ribs, a violent, desperate rhythm. Her blood ran cold. "What in heaven's name are you talking about? Open this door, sir, now!" Langford merely smiled, a terrifyingly genuine expression of cruel satisfaction. He took another step toward her, forcing her to retreat until her back met the cold satin of the wall hanging. It was in that exact horrifying moment, as Charlotte lifted her hand to strike him and he leaned in with a mockery of affection, that the salon door was thrown open. The glare of the hallway gaslight seemed blinding. Framed in the archway, his face a mask of rigid disapproval, was the Duke of Roxburgh himself, flanked by Charlotte's horrified mother and a trio of the season's most venomous matrons. Their collective gasp was loud enough to stop the music in the great ballroom. Lady Charlotte Fairborne, the proud, headstrong, and unmarried daughter of a minor baronet, had been discovered alone behind a closed door in a compromising attitude with a notorious rake. Society, a fickle beast fed on gossip and spite, devoured her. By morning, the incident was not merely a rumor. It was a settled fact, embroidered with every salacious detail the London tongue could conjure. Charlotte's passionate nature and sharp tongue, which had once been dismissed as quirks, were now cited as evidence of her depravity. She had been ruined overnight. For Lady Henrietta Fairborne, this was not just a social disaster. It was the obliteration of all her aspirations. Charlotte's indignant protestations of innocence were dismissed as hysterics. Langford, the villain, played his part to perfection, adopting a mournful, regretful mien, sighing about a misunderstanding, and swearing he only had Charlotte's delicate honor at heart, thereby cementing the impression that she had been the aggressor, attempting to force his hand into marriage. The Fairborne family seat was now a stage for whispered arguments and the heavy silence of shame. Lady Henrietta, pale with desperation, paced the drawing room, her silks rustling like dead leaves. "You absolute fool, Charlotte! Did you truly think you could escape the consequences of such recklessness? Langford has spun his web, and now we are all caught in it. I was trapped, mother. He locked the door. I did nothing dishonorable." Charlotte cried, her voice raw with frustration and wounded dignity. "You cannot believe him over your own daughter." Lady Henrietta's eyes were cold and hard. "I believe what society dictates, child, and society says you have compromised your name. The question now is not why, but how we survive this." The answer, as always in their world, was a pragmatic, brutal solution: marriage. The gossip, however, had entangled another figure in its malicious wake, a man whose name was rarely uttered in connection with scandal, or indeed with anything other than an imposing, icy gravity: Count Adrian de Vere. The whispers claimed that before he had cornered Charlotte, Langford had been overheard making crude, speculative remarks about Adrian's first marriage, linking the present scandal to the mysterious death of the late Countess years prior. The two rumors had by sheer accident converged, and Adrian, a man who guarded his private life with the ferocity of a dragon, had been dragged into the sordid mess. When a letter arrived 2 days later bearing the formidable stark black seal of Count Adrian de Vere, it did not contain a chivalrous offer of aid. It contained a demand. Lady Henrietta clutched the parchment as if it were a life raft. "He offers a solution, Charlotte, the only solution we must accept immediately." Charlotte seized the letter, her eyes flying over the Count's severe, clipped penmanship. The words were a masterpiece of cold, detached arrangement. Marriage was necessary to silence the shared scandal. The union would be one of convenience only. My name will shield yours, and yours will serve to distract from the tiresome rumors that have resurfaced about my own past. Terms are non-negotiable. Her blood boiled. She despised the idea of him. Count Adrian de Vere, the enigmatic widower of 33, known only for his immense wealth, his reclusive nature, and the impenetrable, brooding coldness of his public demeanor. She had met him briefly a few times, and each encounter was characterized by his dismissive air of superiority, his judgmental, weary gaze that seemed to find her entire existence an inconvenience. He was, to her mind, arrogant, haunted, and utterly indifferent. "No," she whispered, the word thick with loathing. I will not be purchased to whitewash the reputation of a man I despise merely because society has decided to martyr me for a lie." "You will, Charlotte," her mother hissed, her grip like iron. "His name is the only one strong enough to silence the talk. He is the Count. He is power. You have no choice unless you wish to spend the rest of your days as a ruined spinster, a pariah whispered about in drawing rooms. You owe us this." The weight of her family's shame, the devastation she had unwillingly wrought upon her mother's social standing, crashed down upon her. She looked at the Count's seal again, a black raven against a blood-red field, a fitting emblem for a man she felt was coming to claim her soul. Her final, heartbroken vow of protest died in her throat. She had been wronged by society, yet she was forced to pay the ultimate price. The wedding was a mockery of a sacred rite. It was performed 3 days later in the Fairborne's small, cold, private chapel, an affair so hurried and secretive that it felt less like a celebration and more like a necessary burial. Only a few family members and solicitors were in attendance. Count Adrian de Vere stood before the altar, a figure of uncompromising severity in a dark frock coat. He looked taller, broader, and more unnervingly remote than Charlotte remembered. His face was a study in controlled emotion, his jaw set, his eyes, a deep, impenetrable gray, focused on some distant, unseen point. He offered no comforting glance, no reassurance, not even a look of shared resignation. He radiated an absolute, profound indifference. When he was required to take her hand, his touch was cool, impersonal, and brief. When he said the words of the vow, his voice was a low, steady monotone that lacked any trace of warmth or conviction. Charlotte, dressed in a simple, unbecoming gown of gray silk, felt a burning coal of resentment settle deep in her chest. She repeated the vows with a defiance that was wholly internal, her sharp mind formulating a private, silent oath. "I will never forgive you for this indifference, Count. Never. You have taken my freedom, but you will never take my pride, and you will certainly never reach my heart." And Adrian, meeting her fierce, wounded gaze for a fleeting moment before turning away, made his own unspoken vow. "This marriage is a punishment. I will do my duty, secure our names, and ensure the scandal is silenced. Beyond that, I will never open myself to pain or vulnerability again." The marriage ended not with a kiss, but with the stark, chilling sound of a pen scratching Adrian's signature on the register. The Count's unwanted bride was officially his. Charlotte Fairborne had been destroyed by a lie. Charlotte, Countess de Vere, had just begun a war. Part 2. A House of Shadows. The Count's country seat, Ashworth Manor, was not merely a house. It was a fortress carved out of old stone and silence. It sat brooding on a windswept rise in the remote northern countryside, its architecture a severe Gothic monument to the ancient, unsmiling wealth of the de Vere line. To Charlotte, who had always thrived on the clamor and color of London, the place felt less like a home and more like an imposing, elegant prison. She arrived late on a blustery gray afternoon. The journey from the city had been long and silent, shared only with the rhythmic clatter of the carriage wheels and the suffocating presence of her new husband. Adrian de Vere had not offered a single word of comfort, nor even a conventional inquiry into her fatigue. He simply sat, a study in rigid formality, occasionally glancing out at the passing landscape with the expression of a man seeking escape rather than arrival. As the carriage finally crunched over the gravel drive, Charlotte looked up at the manor's severe facade. The windows were vast, leaded panes that reflected the bruised sky, many of them shuttered, giving the entire structure the look of a face with its eyes closed against the world. It was a world of shadows and secrets, and she was now bound to it. The housekeeper, Mrs. Dalton, met them in the echoing marble hall. Mrs. Dalton was a tall, bony woman whose expression suggested that she viewed the presence of a new countess as a regrettable yet temporary clerical error. She offered Charlotte a curt, dry curtsy. "Welcome to Ashworth, my lady," she intoned, her voice as crisp as starched linen. "Your rooms are ready." Adrian merely nodded to the housekeeper, his manner dismissing both women in a single economical gesture. "You will dine at 7, Countess. I have matters requiring my attention in the study. Thomas will see to your needs." And with that, he was gone, a dark, swift shadow retreating down a cavernous side corridor. The marriage, only hours old, had settled immediately into a chilling routine, silence, and separation. Charlotte spent the first weeks in a state of bewildered, simmering resentment. Adrian kept utterly to his study, an immense oak-paneled chamber deep in the west wing, emerging only for the brief, painful ritual of dinner. Their evenings were a masterpiece of social agony. They ate at a dining table that could comfortably seat 20, the vast space amplifying the dreadful silence between them. The food was impeccable, the service meticulous, but the atmosphere was that of a mausoleum. Charlotte tried on the first evening to introduce a civil topic, a query about the estate's tenant farms, but Adrian had merely cut her off with a cool gaffe. "I assure you, Countess, the accounts are well in order. There is no need for you to trouble yourself with such particulars." After that, she stopped trying. Instead, she mastered the art of holding her proud head high while enduring his presence. She would study the intricate ceiling plasterwork or the flicker of the candlelight, rather than look at his profile, which was always taut, always distant. The only sound during these meals was the delicate clinking of silver, a constant, tiny reminder of the heavy, unspoken contract that bound them. The servants, she soon discovered, did not merely respect the Count, they feared him. They moved on hushed feet, their eyes always lowered, their answers to her questions brief and fearful. When she asked Mrs. Dalton about the history of a particular portrait, the housekeeper merely stiffened and replied, "It is a relative, my lady. The Count prefers silence in the halls." It confirmed her initial belief. This house was ruled by its master's guilt and loneliness, and she was merely another piece of furniture placed to deflect unwanted curiosity. She felt the weight of the past in every shuttered room, every darkened corridor. One evening, unable to bear the oppressive silence of her own grand suite, Charlotte ventured out. The moon was high and bright, slicing through the mullioned windows and striping the polished floors with silver. She wandered down the main corridor, her silk dressing gown whispering against the stone, drawn by an almost imperceptible sound emanating from the heart of the house. It was music. It was not the cheerful, superficial air of a London drawing room, but a piece of intense, haunting complexity. It was mournful, yet possessing a wild, passionate energy, a melody that spoke of deep grief and unbearable yearning. Charlotte crept closer, following the sound until she reached a set of double doors leading to the grand saloon, a room Mrs. Dalton had informed her was never used. She pressed her ear to the wood and listened, transfixed. The music was being played on the piano, with a dexterity and profound emotional weight that shocked her to the core. This was not the work of a hobbyist, it was the outpouring of a soul in pain. When the final agonizing chord faded into the silence, Charlotte drew a slow breath. This was a crack in the Count's impregnable facade. The cold, remote man had a capacity for feeling. A man who could play music like that had once been capable of love. A sudden, sharp desire to see him, to understand the source of that raw emotion, overcame her caution. She quietly pushed the door ajar. The grand saloon was dimly lit by a single, sputtering candle placed atop the piano. Count Adrian de Vere sat hunched on the bench, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped in an attitude of complete exhaustion. He was not the formidable, distant nobleman of the dining room, but a man entirely stripped of his control. The candlelight illuminated the subtle lines of strain around his eyes, the weariness etched deep into his features. And then she saw it. On the edge of the sheet music, placed where his left hand had rested, was a small, tarnished silver locket. It was an object he would never leave lying about, an intimate token of loss. Charlotte pulled back swiftly, her heart pounding a frantic tattoo. She had seen too much. She had seen the ghost of the man he once was, the man who grieved. Standing there in the shadow of the doorway, the music still echoing in her mind, a terrible, thrilling suspicion began to form. Adrian's coldness was not merely arrogance or indifference. It was a wall, built high and thick to contain a monumental sorrow. And she suddenly realized that the roots of his grief must be deeply intertwined with the mysterious death of his first wife, the tragedy that society had so eagerly linked to her own recent scandal. Charlotte had come to Ashworth determined to hate him, determined to defy the man who had bought her silence. But as she retreated back to her lonely room, she carried a new burden, a wary, reluctant empathy. She had married a shell of a man, and the prideful resentment that had sustained her was now threatened by a fragile, undeniable question. What terrible thing had truly happened in this house to break the Count's heart? Part 3. The Thorn and the Rose. Charlotte refused to be a ghost. The silent, shuttered atmosphere of Ashworth Manor, which Adrian seemed so determined to maintain, fueled her prideful resistance. She was Lady Charlotte Fairborne still, not merely the Count's unwanted bride, and she would not permit herself to be extinguished by the weight of his sorrow or the coldness of his indifference. If Adrian intended to rule their household through silence, she would use her voice as a weapon. Their dinners, previously agonizing exercises in mutual avoidance, became the battlegrounds Charlotte had determined they would be. She started by subtly challenging his aloofness, then escalated to outright provocation. "Tell me, Count," she began one evening, watching him carve a sliver of rare venison with surgical precision. "Is it a custom of the de Vere family to keep the drawing rooms shrouded in perpetual gloom? Or is it merely your personal conviction that gaiety is a vice?" Adrian paused, his hand perfectly steady, his gray eyes lifting slowly to meet hers across the vast expanse of the mahogany table. "I find, Countess, that those who have a surfeit of wit to recommend them often require little aid from cheerful surroundings." His voice was a low, resonant drawl, weighted with contempt. "And I find," she retorted, a flicker of heat entering her own eyes, "that those who choose to live in darkness are often terrified of what a little light might reveal." The tension between them was a tangible force, hotter and more volatile than the candles flickering in the silver sconces. Their exchanges were sharp, fierce glares and pointed words, each aimed at breaching the other's formidable defenses. Yet, for all their sparring, a perverse vitality entered their sterile marriage. They were acknowledging one another, even if only as adversaries. But for all her spirited defiance, Charlotte was still trapped. To escape the stifling walls of Ashworth, she took to riding out across the Count's extensive wild parkland. One afternoon, a fierce, sudden storm swept in from the coast. Caught miles from the manor, Charlotte pushed her horse hard, determined to outrun the deluge. By the time she burst through the front doors, drenched and shivering, a fierce ache had settled in her chest. The following morning, she awoke consumed by fever. She was vaguely aware of a flurry of activity: Mrs. Dalton's grim disapproval, the hurried arrival of the local physician, but the fever held her captive, tossing her between bouts of burning heat and icy chills. When the crisis finally broke in the deepest hour of the night, Charlotte surfaced slowly, finding the room dimly lit by a lamp and the air thick with the scent of herbs. She felt terribly weak, but the pain had subsided. And then she saw him. Count Adrian de Vere was not in his study. He was seated in a chair beside her bed. His waistcoat was unbuttoned, his silk cravat loosened, and he looked profoundly exhausted. He had been attending her. As Charlotte attempted to shift, a cough catching in her dry throat, Adrian moved instantly. He pressed a glass of cool water to her lips, his expression entirely devoid of its usual cold detachment. It was instead etched with a startling compassion, raw and genuine. "Drink slowly, Charlotte," he instructed, his voice low, lacking all its customary severity. The casual use of her first name, the gentle curve of his hand as he supported her head, it was a disarming breach of their contract. She obeyed, staring at him. You are here," she managed to whisper. He drew his hand away, his facade attempting to reassert itself, though his exhaustion weakened its effect. "You are my wife, Countess. I will not have it said that a de Vere was permitted to succumb to a mere egg while under my roof." It was the explanation of a man of duty, but the look in his eyes betrayed him. "You have been here long," she observed, her voice barely a breath. "Why?" Adrian rose and moved to the mantelpiece, leaning his arm against it, turning away slightly. The movement was slow, heavy, as if he carried a great burden. When he spoke, his voice was tight, a low confession wrenched from deep within him. "I cannot bear to watch suffering that I can prevent, Charlotte. Not again." He paused, the silence stretching tautly between them, filled with all the unspoken history of Ashworth. "My first marriage, it ended tragically. My late wife, Genevieve, she was taken by a sudden illness, a fever, much like yours." Charlotte held her breath at the truth she had long suspected now unfolding before her. "I was absent," Adrian continued, his voice rough with self-reproach, "attending to business in London. I convinced myself it was necessary. I left her, convinced that I was indispensable to my family's holdings. And when I returned, it was too late. I was not there to secure the physician or to sit by her side. I left her alone." He turned back, and the anguish in his eyes was naked, unmistakable. "I have spent the years since convinced that my neglect, my dedication to a lifeless duty over a living, breathing person, killed her. I buried my heart along with her, determined never to risk the pain of attachment again, to punish myself with solitude." He let out a long, shuddering breath. "Watching you struggle, I saw her, Charlotte. I saw what happens when one abandons responsibility out of selfish fear. I swore I would not fail again." The revelation stripped away the cold Count, leaving behind a profoundly wounded man consumed by guilt. He hadn't been indifferent. He had been drowning in self-blame. The air between them fractured. The enemies to lovers dynamic, built on sharp words and fierce glares, shifted suddenly, irrevocably, to wary empathy. Charlotte saw not the arrogant nobleman she had despised, but a man imprisoned by a ghost. She no longer wanted to fight him. She wanted to reach him. She whispered, her voice weak but clear, "You were sick with duty, Adrian, not malice. That is not the same as killing someone." He simply shook his head, unable to accept the absolution. He was punishing himself for a crime no one else had accused him of. For the first time since their forced silent wedding, Charlotte did not feel resentment for her husband. She felt a connection, a profound, aching sorrow for the lonely, self-flagellating man who had finally tentatively allowed a small piece of his tortured past to surface. The thorn of their marriage had just revealed the fragile, vulnerable petals of a broken rose. Charlotte has finally seen the ghost of the man behind the cold facade. The Count's confession, that he blames himself for his first wife's tragic death, has utterly changed the landscape of their war. Their sharp words have given way to a fragile, aching empathy, but Adrian still clings to his guilt, and the house still holds its secrets. You have just finished part 1, The Agony of the Unwanted. Will this newfound understanding be enough to break the walls Adrian has built, or is a deeper, more dangerous truth yet to be uncovered? Get ready for the revelations that await in part 2.